Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us in ENO's latest webinar. I'm Brianne Eby, a Senior Policy Analyst at ENO, and today I'm looking forward to a discussion about transportation modeling. The presentation will cover some of the technical aspects of transportation modeling and how modeling can be used to inform decision-making. Joining us today is Ambar Johnson, Program Director of the LivableStreets Alliance, which advocates for innovative and equitable transportation solutions in Metro Boston. There, Ambar oversees Vision Zero, Better Buses, and the Emerald Network programs. Ambar is a graduate of the Georgia Institute of Technology. While Ambar is speaking, you can submit questions using the questions function at any time, and we'll then go to about 15, 20 minutes of Q&A, and you can submit questions then as well. Today's presentation will be available after the fact on ENO's website. With that, I will turn it over to Ambar.
Great, thanks, Brianne. And hi, everyone. Oops. Okay, there we go. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining our conversation today, What Counts in Mobility? Rethinking Transportation Modeling. I am your host or panelist, Ambar Johnson. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a transportation planner, bicycle instructor, and program director at LivableStreets, where I directly manage the Emerald Network, a portfolio of 200 miles of greenways throughout Metro Boston. Just before we get started, I want to give you an overview of today's discussion. Today, I'll be providing an overview of our transportation modeling report, What Counts in Mobility. From that, we'll explore some gaps and areas of improvements for transportation models that we found. And hopefully we'll be able to use those findings to inform better decision-making for multimodal projects. So with that being said, I'll tell you a little bit about LivableStreets and the work that we're doing here in Boston. Like Brianne mentioned, LivableStreets is a transportation advocacy organization here, and we envision a world where people are able to travel safely through public spaces that connect people to where they need to go, wherever that is, whatever mode that is. And hopefully we hope to do that and we advocate for innovative, equitable transportation solutions for a safe, affordable, and convenient Boston. And how we do that, we have our 4 program areas, Great Neighborhoods being our newest. So we have Vision Zero, we have Great Neighborhoods, Better Buses, and the Emerald Network, which is the program that I directly manage. So what brought us here today to discuss transportation modeling? Well, we have to go back in time a little bit to roughly 2018. LivableStreets, in conjunction with our advocacy partners in Boston, like Boston Cyclists Union and Mass Bike and other advocacy partners, had a project before my time regarding the Longfellow Bridge. This bridge was up for reconstruction, and during that time, like many construction projects, there are counts done before the project is finished, and there is an anticipated model that anticipates how many vehicles will be going over said bridge or any kind of project. What we found interesting regarding this particular project and what piqued our interest in going about asking questions about the model is that we found, or my colleagues found, and through these MassDOT counts, which is the state transportation agency for Massachusetts, is that the 4-step model anticipated about 1,700 vehicles traveling over this bridge during the AM peak, and of course, roughly 2,100 for the outbound. But what was interesting, what we found, is that post-construction, there was about 580 vehicles that went over that bridge inbound and 400 outbound, meaning when we compare these numbers, there's about a 30% gap in what the model predicted versus the actual reality that was happening. And that caused us to pause and say, well, if this is happening here in terms of building this construction project and what the model anticipated, where are some other places that we may not know about where this amount of gap might be happening? So one of the things that we wanted and why we decided to go about this is because models are used to make decisions about transportation projects. But mostly common people and even transportation professionals like myself may not understand them completely. And they largely, because of the history of the model, given its history beginning in 1950 and the prioritization of automobiles, translate to expanding roles in building highways. But what we wanted to do was make sure that projects are serving people. And for those who aren't advocates like ourselves, will be able to equip themselves when they go to public meetings and other places where they're presented numbers justifying lane expansion or reduction to ask, where did those numbers come from? And ultimately, what guided our questioning and our appetite for this report is wondering, what if everyday people understood travel demand models to advocate for those sustainable multimodal options that they're craving for? So how we did that, we did a few things. We assessed how the model is experienced by practitioners and advocates, meaning we talked to a whole bunch of people throughout the Commonwealth, people we were happy to partner with agencies and also our advocacy partners. What we did next was assess the inner workings or the process of modeling, meaning we did a lot of process maps to understand where is data coming in and what's coming out from that data. And ultimately, what we did, and probably like this webinar, we left with much more questions than we even anticipated going in with. And with that, we had questions, and we also have a few recommendations on how to calibrate this model so the vision and future that it's predicting is aligned with those who live within the reality of it. Thankfully, I did not do this project by myself because that would have been impossible. We were able to collaborate with Tufts University's Graduate School of Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning, where there's a specific course called Field Projects, where graduate students help nonprofit advocacy organizations like LivableStreets and municipalities throughout the Commonwealth to help them with their projects that they have on hand. Luckily, we were accompanied by these amazing students who helped us really think and push further into this modeling. And on the Livable Streets side, we had one of our trustee volunteers who's also a senior associate at ITDP, Aryaf Sevet, to help guide and facilitate this process so we could get a robust report for us to look to in terms of how do we advocate in the projects that we're pushing for and might be thinking about in terms of the region that we live in. Also, I just want to shout out and explain or let you all know that we are really happy that we were able to talk to so many practitioners and agencies throughout the Commonwealth. Livable Streets really prides ourselves on being able to collaborate with municipalities and state agencies and really understand what are those challenges so we can collectively get what we all want, which is better transportation. So we thank our partners who were able to speak with us and be able to give us some insight for how transportation modeling works. That being said, the goal that we had when we thought about it is that what we really want to do is strengthen the link between the model, the four-step model, and policy decision-making that goes into it. This is a really expanded decision tree of just some of the things that we wanted to go into. But ultimately, like I mentioned before, we want to show you all some of the places where there's room for improvement for those models and be able to explain those things to regular people and to practitioners to think about how we can use those findings to calibrate a better model. So one of the first things that we did before we got started is that we decided to assess the region. And in assessing the region, meaning understanding the system and the relationships at play for transportation, development, and other intersections. Usually advocates, we get a reputation for being against everyone, or even other transportation advocates or practitioners find themselves within silos. So, you know, there's people who work in the public, there's those who are private sector consultants, there's those who work at federal agencies. And what we wanted to understand was, what is that relationship like on a larger scale? Where does the data come from and where does funding come from to ensure these projects are even viable? With that, we have in the center CTPS, which is the Central Transportation Planning staff of the Boston Metropolitan Planning Organization in Boston, who are responsible for the four-step model in our region. From there, we decided to see how CTPS and other actors within the transportation world that seems to be so small interact with each other. Over here in the pink, you'll find advocacy organizations and citizens like LivableStreets and how we engage with other agencies, whether they be federal or municipal. And from these, we determine the relationship, whether that's a client, whether that's community engagement, whether that's applying for funding, to see what is this ecosystem that we're already working in. The next thing that we had to do was, of course, understand how does modeling work. This is a really It doesn't have to be a complicated process, so I'll be brief in what I'm sharing. But ultimately, from what a lot of people know about transportation modeling, it began in the 1950s with the post-war movement and highway construction. And essentially, to be brief, modeling is derived from a four-step process. That four-step process is to help us ask questions. If we built a new project in a specific location, how would the system, the overall transportation system, respond? Or what would happen to congestion if we added another lane to these streets? Ultimately, the goal of modeling is to give decision makers a forecast to assess all their options and make better informed decisions about where those projects go. So the four-step process, in very simple and visual terms, starts from trip generation to trip distribution, mode choice, and trip assignment. Meaning there are people who live within specific areas, and the model tries to anticipate where will those people go within this certain geography. And those are known as TAZs, or traffic analysis zones. After that, those zones anticipate how people will move within them, and how is usually derived from mode choice. And as we see over here in the slide, there's multiple forms of modes. After that, the final step is trip assignment, to assign the volume of the different modes among each one of those individual squares called TAZs, and then from there, help to build the concrete road network. So it's based on the assumption that people will minimize their travel costs by choosing the best route and the best road service level to influence users' choices for how they get around. But one of the things that we thought was interesting when it comes to this kind of work is understanding that the model is only as good as the input that it has. And though there are many different things put into the transportation model, such as traffic counts, transit counts, land use data, cost to travel, demographic data, and other factors, there's still other things at play. We should notice that the accuracy of these trip generation is decided by the quality of these data inputs that I just listed and more, and those assumptions within the actual formula of modeling. Unfortunately, though, sometimes this data can be incomplete or insufficient. Some assumptions that the things that we came up with, which generated a lot of questions for our team, was what's the interpretation of that data? And how will policymakers and urban planners decipher that data in order to make decisions? Sometimes we think about all of these different kind of things related to the inputs that are put in, but what's weighed as favorable and what's not weighted as favorable? So that ultimately made us try to question, what are those missing factors in there that assess what's not going into this transportation model? As we mentioned before, the data of the four-step data quality within the four-step model and the assumptions determine the accuracy of the predictions. In very short layman terms, whatever you put in, you're going to get out. And if what you're putting in is incomplete, then what you get out will be incomplete. One of the things that we wanted to talk about, though, were things like the missing factors that we found within each step of the process, the four-step model that we found. So things like personal or perceived safety is one. Trip training, how and where people will go. Detailed trip purposes. An example of this is the model, though it is sophisticated in ways, it's really difficult for the model to discern the difference between shopping for groceries and shopping for furniture. When you shop for groceries, you might be able to use transit or walk, but if you're shopping for furniture, unless it's a very particular choice, that's something that's light, you're more than likely not going to take that on a ferry or on a train. So when we think about these things that can be done on foot or that require a vehicle, these lack of variables that are sensitive might not be as sensitive to transit and walking, and that might leave gaps in knowledge about demand for transit and demands for pedestrian use. One other thing that we thought was interesting as we were doing this extremely meta thinking about transportation modeling and what things mean is bias. The fact that there are things that are missing within the model are indicators of two things. One, maybe there's like all these things that practitioners are not able to input or hold. But the other is that when you're choosing which data is most important, or noticing that there are nuances within the data that you're collecting that cannot be perceived or put as a certain value judgment, there's some bias. And though as planners and people who love data, some people love data because there's an inherent objectivity surrounding it. But the idea that models are technical and therefore objective is incorrect can be very misleading. When we think about whether these things are misleading, we have to understand, well, why? Just like any other technology, our data or our technology is only created by those who create them. It doesn't just miraculously materialize. So one of the things that we thought was important is to acknowledge that transportation models are developed by people. And people, consciously or unconsciously, have their own assumptions and biases about the future, about their conditions, and can inherently interfere with this quote unquote objectivity about what kind of projects are being prioritized or implemented. Within this uncovering bias, one thing I do want to point out is that it's interesting when advocates as a whole might say, multimodal future, we want people over cars. But even then, we have to remember that there are people within those cars. So though that we might think that we're advocating for more multimodal, sustainable presence and future, we have to acknowledge the fact that over it all, it's still thinking about which people we are prioritizing. And that's something to think about. One of the things that we thought from the interviews that we were able to gather from our informational interviews with constituents, with volunteers, with practitioners in all different parts of the transportation industry, we really thought this one was pretty cool to point out, as it wasn't just our volunteer. There are other folks who highlighted this assumption as well. I don't know about you, but sometimes if you go to public meetings, you might see all of these numbers on the table, and these numbers inform what kind of transportation projects will be there and why. One thing a volunteer of ours mentioned was, it would be really nice if agencies could talk to the public before running the model and to let them know, hey, we're going to run this and we're going to try to answer specific questions. These are the inputs and variables that we're thinking of. What do you think is missing? And then after those factors are talked about and the model is ran, asking constituents and community members, what we found, does this match your version of reality? We thought that was really important to do in terms of ensuring that there's always community input involved in the technology that we developed to ensure that the things that the people want are actually being represented through technology, like modeling. I'm going to take a very short pause of talking about modeling and plug one of the really cool reports that we're working on or have worked on in the past at LivableStreets. In 2018, the city of Boston has had a few different plans. There's Imagine Boston 2030 and Go Boston 2030, which imagines a transportation future, a vision and action plan for what transportation will look like in the next decade. Granted, it is important to note that these are things that occurred before COVID, which we might touch on briefly in this presentation. Within this amazing and robust vision and action plan, my colleague Louisa Gag, who's policy director at LivableStreets, created an accountability plan, a framework to ensure that the city is on track to complete the goals and projects that it listed out in its report. Right now, we have 10 years to get to what the city envisions to have done in terms of projects. And from our latest report, which you can find on our website at livablestreets.info, we see that the city is making progress with many of the things that they said they wanted to do, which is great. One thing that I do want to talk about, though, is this mode split in terms of how Bostonians commute. So as we see today being like 2018 or so, 34% of Bostonians use public transportation to go to and from their jobs. And the city envisions that that will go up by a third. And Today, about 40% of people drive alone to commute. And the city envisions a future where 20% in 2030 will be driving alone to work. And we thought about this and we said, wow, we're really proud of the work that we were able to do to measure specific projects accountability. It's really great to be able to have a great relationship with city staff and talk to community members and see what's going on. But when it comes to these goals, these high-level goals in terms of shifting behavior, that's a little bit harder to track. And the thing that will really set us up to ask these questions is, how are we going to ensure that the goals that the city or the state has within their plans are being reflected by the model? Though we know that transportation models tend to be useful for current conditions, at times they are not as sophisticated in predicting the future if the goal is to change behavior or plan for a different future. We really think it's important that the technology that we're using to advance our modes across cities and towns reflect the wider range of needs that people have while they're traveling. So for us, that made us ask a question and go back to a lot of other information, data, if you will, of state plans, of city plans, and all of these these measured goals in terms of increasing transit by a third from 34% or decreasing driving alone to 20% in 10 years. How does the city, how does the state, how do these agencies ensure that they are reaching their goal? And is that model actually calibrated to that? If we don't have time or space to ensure that we are calibrating these goals that we write within our state plans, are ensuring with our technology that predicts what kind of transportation infrastructure will be built, we'll inherently just miss each other. We need to make sure that these visions and goals are aligned with our technology if we truly want to see this future that we talk about. And then that leads us to other questions regarding intent and impact, which is a whole other conversation. But the things that are really important to ask ourselves as practitioners as we're feeding these models this data. So in short, those were just very high level things that we found. If I talked about this with you at length, I could talk about it for a week. Also, we have a report that you'll be able to find later. But what we found as the basic recommendations that we believe can be transferred to you who are watching, who work within your agencies, your cities, or even if you're a really avid meeting goer, these are some of the things that we thought would be beneficial to you. So one of the things that we thought and that really helped us catalyze this project was having before and after counts. Overall, this is a message of asset management. Just as we want to make sure that our potholes are filled on our streets, it's vital that we are making sure that our data is up to date. And with before and after counts, that's more so asking, what would it look like if our agencies or our cities and states were able to do a before and after count of the projects that we do? And what if we were able to use that and compare it with our model to see what percentage are we off and how can we make that better? The other part in terms of before and after counts and data is ensuring that we remember that at times this model, which was built or conceptualized, if you will, and implemented from the 1950s, is aligned with the 2020 visions and purposes that we have. The next part that we wanted to touch on is expanding the data. What we found, and especially our graduate students found, is that there's a deficiency of robust urban and human scale data. Of course, there are many new things like streetlight data and other mechanisms that show where people are moving. But how great would it be if we were to have input on how many people are using greenways, how many people are using are actually like walking and cycling to places? At times, as we know, or as collecting data for these things can be sporadic depending on how it's done. And when things are sporadic, it doesn't really lead to reliable information. So ensuring that we expand the data to make sure it's reliant. And the need to have better and more comprehensive data inputs, that goes to resourcing our plans and resourcing what people have been saying for a number of years that we know to be true from the data-driven and story-driven methods that we've employed as urban planners. The next part that I wanted to touch on was uncovering bias. One of the ways that we think that can happen is by decentralizing the dependability on the model. The idea that the model is correct and therefore objective can really lead us off target for things that are actually happening with reality that aren't inputted within it. It also gives us some time to have more transparency with our decision makers and transparency within agencies to ensure that what you're seeing is also matching the reality. And with that, matching the reality, that includes including community feedback at more stages of the planning process and including historic information about what we know to be true in terms of trends that we see in transportation, land use, and development. The last thing that we thought was great to help us ensure the accuracy of the model, because we do know it is helpful, is to ensure that we find tools that complement the model for multimodal goals. So that means making sure that the state goals and the city goals that we have are actually aligned and calibrated through that. And also to collaborate across sectors and communities for reality checks. It's really important that people are able to talk to each other to understand what's going on. And more than likely than not, we realize that when we talk together, we realize we have common goals and we really want to solve the same thing. It's just different approaches to getting there. So anyway, I've said enough and my time is up. If you want to look more into this report in more detail, feel free to go to emeraldnetwork.info for resources and learn more about our amazing graduate student group who were able to help us bring this report into the world. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Amber. We've had a bunch of good questions come in already, and folks can feel free to continue submitting those as we go. I'll keep coming through those in the 20 minutes or so that we have left for Q&A. But I'll start with some of the early ones that have come in. There's some here wondering if you can go into some more specific examples of biases in data inputs and the assumptions within a formula, and how those might be problematic in decision making. How do we ensure that the data that we're collecting is inclusive or equitable? That's another maybe related question alongside that.
Yeah, so let me go back here to one of our missing factors here, just like take some time to look at that for those who also might find that interesting. In short, what I believe I heard from the question is, well, how do you find that bias? It's really interesting in terms of thinking about bias. A lot of people think that it's just in terms of human-to-human interaction, right? Like, you know, they talk to me this specific way, this particular thing happened, this person inherently hates or doesn't even realize that they might strongly dislike me or an aspect of a person. What planners, especially those within transportation, need to realize is that we do this as well too in terms of our work. One thing that I always think is interesting is just thinking about one thing that often comes up but isn't integrated within these things is talking about using the bus, right? So LivableStreets has a report called the 64 Hours Report, and it shows that 64%, or sorry, Black bus riders in Boston spend 64% more time waiting for the bus and on the bus than their counterparts. So right here, we have in mode split comfort and reliability. If we were able to gauge comfort and reliability about, you know, we hear all these things about negative things regarding transit, and those negative or unideal situations and dealing with transit, whether that's waiting for it or even being on the bus, right? We don't really talk about that, and there's no way to really measure that. So it's really important, and what I find a way to really find this bias, I think of course, one could say, put yourself in someone else's shoes and be able to experience life as if it wasn't just you, who might not have to think about what is the bus schedule and what your life might look like, or what kind of trust would you have within your transit route or what have you, if it wasn't that big of a deal, if you will. That might not have made as much sense. But essentially what I'm trying to say is, one, you can put yourself in the other person's shoes, but two, being able to be aware of how people are experiencing transportation. An experience on the sidewalk for me or for someone who has physical disabilities, that comfort level is going to be extremely different from someone who's able-bodied. But these are the things that we may not be thinking about when we're at our desk compiling data and putting this within the model. So there's a lot of human factors in terms of the realities that people are experiencing, and those realities aren't calibrated or inputted in the model. Therefore, they just get lost because it's literally not there. So I hope that answers or touches on those points in terms of equity and uncovering bias. I also feel as if being able to just have more voices and listen to those voices and apply what those voices have said really helps get to that mark of closing these missing factors.
That's great, thank you. Do you think that modeling professionals gain a fuller understanding of their own models by explaining them to advocates and to the public? And if so, how might we encourage more of this type of interaction or more of that interfacing between the people who are doing the modeling and the people who should be using the models?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's funny, what I found in my work as a planner and as an advocate and even doing research in the past is that when we talk about the model, it's literally this black box. It's like, what the heck is in it? And a lot of people don't know. It's interesting. I think it's pretty clear to say at times every profession has these slight prejudices in terms of value of the work. So in terms of transportation, at times there might not be as much focus or appetite to do community engagement, and versus someone who's an engineer who might feel a lot of pride in that, and that community engagement is useless. You know, there's usually like this discord with even within our own industry and what roles we play. I think that if we're able to, and what I love about being able to be collaborative in the work that we do at LivableStreets and even other parts of my life, just being able to talk to other people, seeing how people approach the work. What are the methods that people are using when they're going into it? What are the lenses that they're using, or what is their what's their attitude, or their feelings about the work? I feel like that really highlights a lot of those these gaps or assumptions of what we think about the model. But what we found in the past is that when you talk about the model, it's off limits. We just believe it. We believe it because the engineers did it. They calibrated all these things, and we just don't question it anymore. And what we found is being able to just ask questions and really think about these things as we want to talk to you. Like, we know that there's a challenge. We see that challenge. We're pretty sure, and we know that like you experienced that challenge as well. Let us work together to figure out how we can solve for that challenge so we can meet each other more clearly. I feel as if, especially in this time of COVID, there are so many people working extremely hard, and it feels as if like all that work is just like not appreciated. It's like, I'm doing all of this and you're not seeing it. But what we really did, especially regarding this particular exercise of interrogating the model, is really coming in and saying, okay, we notice all these things too. Can you just explain to us a little bit more? And I think if we were to find a way for these engineers and other transportation practitioners to just be a little bit less removed from the public and be able to ask or answer these kind of questions that people are having, knowing that people really just want to know and not putting value judgments on people asking questions, I think that would get us in a place where people feel invited to ask more questions.
Great, thank you. So a couple of questions have come up on this, the topic of health in modeling. Can you describe maybe some of the adaptations that have been made to modeling, or how models are used to reflect the current situation that we're in? So in other words, the pandemic, or maybe on the flip side of that, how do models incorporate extremes like pandemics? I mean, obviously the point of a model is to kind of anticipate future travel behaviors, but what about these kind of unforeseen circumstances?
Yeah, like we mentioned before, there is the model can really be, it's really good for day-to-day. It's not that great in terms of like pandemic response. As we've seen on the news, I thought it was really, well, I thought it was really interesting to see that, they have a model predicting how this spreads and all these kind of factors that are in play. One of the ways in which we've thought about using the model to incorporate health factors is in ways that we already talk about now. So there are people who talk about physical fitness. There are people who talk about, and there's data, of course, related to environmental factors, health, safety, things like that. Some of the things that we've been thinking about at LivableStreets, we've done two things in terms of this pandemic response. One, we looked at some old things in terms of, or let me back up. In terms of pandemic response and people looking for questions to these answers of how do we fix this, one of the things that we noted was many of the things that people were trying to solve for are challenges that have already been raised regarding, lack of transit service, lack of access to green space, what have you. What we think at LivableStreets and what we've been doing, working with our community partners who are at the intersection of health and food access, is trying to find a way to work with transit agencies and our work and them and fill those gaps so people can get what they need. Another thing that we've done is done extensive mapping in terms of looking at where things are, things being testing sites, things being grocery stores, and asking ourselves and asking partners, what if transportation modeling, instead of thinking of doing the trip assignment and redistribution to these particular land uses, what if it were prioritized to say, we want people to go specifically, we want to make sure that transportation is extremely easy and accessible to medical centers. What if instead of thinking about going to a specific job center location, what if we planned our transportation? What if we planned those nodes to really account for and to ensure access to those things that are vital right now, which is health and food. So with that, what we've been thinking about is how do we get people to work together more to solve these questions? Because of course, we're not health experts, but we do understand how people move. And if we're able to work with those who are health experts and other people within their expertise, we'll definitely be able to get to where we're going together.
Excellent. So actually several people have asked some variation of this next question. So what are some of the alternatives to the four-step model that are being explored by NPOs, Amber? A couple of people suggested activity-based models, disaggregate models, or agent-based models. I don't want to put you on the spot to go into a ton of detail on these or to describe them. But to the extent that you can talk about maybe high-level takeaways of why there are different approaches to modeling and what some of the key differences are, key benefits of other approaches as compared to the four-step model. I think that might be helpful for some.
Yeah, through the research and the report, which definitely has more information regarding the particular models that were brought up. What we know from NPOs and our work with them is that they're doing as much as they can with the information that they have, and that, like everything, it kind of speaks to our recommendation of the decentralization, or rather an understanding that it's not the model alone that makes these decisions to ensure that people can go to where they need to go. One thing that we are working on and we've been really diligent about in our work in the region is ensuring that we're able to work with community partners and other organizations, whether that be agencies, municipalities, and organizations like ourselves, to ensure that people are connecting with people. During COVID, of course, that's hard because there's so much of a time restraint. But the thing that we're really getting to, and that COVID has shown us, is that these are historic challenges that continue to manifest themselves. But what we've seen with the data-driven approaches, or the extreme maps that we all know, where there's 4 different maps and the same areas are highlighted in terms of what needs to be fixed or where the crisis is, what we're really asking for people to do is to pay attention to that and make the decisions based on what you are seeing and what you've been hearing. The funniest thing, going back to what we mentioned before in terms of NPOs being challenged and trying to use more tools, one of the things that we think is really interesting is what if history was a tool? We really think that it's really important to ensure that people are using, instead of trying to create more tools or new frameworks to do, look at the things that we already have. Community members have been giving their input for years now. Really what we're looking for and what we think will be helpful at this point, understanding that there are all these missing factors that technology just might not be able to account for, is to use these people relationships and collaborations and coalitions, listening to them and implementing them. Yeah, I'm sorry that's not as technical or detailed. I know that some people are really anticipating and wanting. It's like, well, what kind of model there? It's like, yes, all of these things they take us to a certain point, but getting to that implementation level of making sure that people are having a multimodal safe experience, and safe meaning for literally all people, that requires integration of different departments and sectors to ensure that that is the goal, that people are actually safe and can get to where they need to go.
Great, thank you. So this might be our last one. We might be able to squeeze in 2 more, but there's one here wondering what, in addition to the options that you presented on your summary and recommendation slide, what can and should be done to improve the usefulness of travel demand models? These might be technical improvements, linking to land use models, using a model as a scenario planning tool. How can models also be improved so that they might be able to evaluate the impacts of new technologies? So I guess just kind of forecasting, what do you see as the future or improvements that might be made to modeling?
Yeah, so there's 2 things that I think about immediately in terms of improving modeling. One is just asset management. I know a lot of us are very concerned about the future and ensuring, like, what can we do next? What can we do next? What can we do next? But a lot of the times we don't even manage what we already have. And in that, we also use language about the future without really regarding the present. So I really recommend, and there's definitely more suggestions within the report. There are several, in fact. One is just basic asset management. Where is your data? Is it up to date? Who are you talking to? How updated is that? And making sure that data isn't just the quantitative, but the qualitative as well. Assess what those missing factors are. What's your relationships like with your advocacy organizations and just the general public? Ask questions, that kind of thing. And 2, we are really interested in asking questions and working with those who develop algorithms for this to say, how can you incorporate community feedback in that? Like, we know that it needs to be done, but what if there is some kind of iterative, like recursive, like backcasting that could happen that really informs, like, as information comes in, it's able to get updated and be added to the model. Granted, I know that models can take weeks at times to run, but what if there is a way to find, to work together with these engineers and other folks who work within agencies that are responsible for that forecast, for that first step model or activity models and other models? What if we were able to work with them and figure out what kind of questions need to be asked? So in short, basic asset management before trying to take on new things. Really do your existing conditions like we're taught as planners. And second, collaborate with those who are working within your sector. Sorry, I just want to go back right here. We have all of these people to our disposal who are working to pretty much do the same exact thing. There are so many connections of who we can be talking to and understand what is their work like and what are the demands and challenges of their work. If there is a way for us to be all in the same line and be able to prioritize those things, we can come up with success instead of being broken off on our own.
Seems like a good note to end on. Thank you so much, Amber, and thank you to our listeners for joining. Tomorrow, we'll be hosting a webinar, Transportation at the Ballot Box, Austin's Project Connect. As always, don't forget to sign up for Transportation Weekly for regular updates on our work and other transportation policy matters. Thank you.
Great, thank you.